over 18 years. That's how long Metroid Fusion remained without a sequel. One, codenamed Dread, was in development for the DS and even teased in Metroid Prime 3, but nothing ever came of it. Supposedly, the DS wasn't quite powerful enough for what they had in mind. Now, all these years later, a new company named Mercury Steam had already proven themselves with a remake of Metroid 2 on the 3DS. Metroid Dread is finally here and on the much more powerful Nintendo Switch that can do their vision justice, but can it live up to Fusion, or was Samus Returns all just a fluke? I hope to answer that right now in my little review. Right off the bat, it becomes obvious that Mercury Steam was tasked with this game. The engine seems to have been lifted from Samus Returns, and many of the things they added, such as Aeon abilities, melee counters, and free aim, are present and accounted for. That's obviously not to say it doesn't add many tricks of its own to the table, the first and foremost being the ability to slide. While you do still get the iconic Morph Ball, albeit a little later than usual, you can now do a pretty cool slide too. This is both for getting through narrow spaces and getting under some things like enemies. It's a nice, swift alternative if the space is brief enough for the momentum to carry through. Even if you need the Morph Ball, it can help get through the space faster, and she'll automatically go into it in those circumstances. Another thing that's sort of different is how Aeon abilities operate. Rather than having to refill a bar with drops from enemies, the Aeon meter fills by itself when you're moving around and not using Aeon abilities. You do still get the Pulse Radar, albeit as the late game ability, but the others have been replaced. Doom 2016 and Eternal feel like they were inspired by Metroid Prime, so it's interesting that one of these seems to have been inspired by Doom Eternal. Specifically, there's the flash step that allows you to flit to the left or right in a manner that reminds me of Eternal's dash. The last one I'm going to talk about is actually the one you get first, the Phantom Cloak. It actually turns Samus invisible Predator style and will eat into her health if you run out of Aeon energy. You can move and shoot, but it drains the bar faster, and while you can jump, horizontal movement is next to none. In other words, you need to be very careful how you use it. Its main use is getting away from the Emmys. Speaking of which, this is perhaps the biggest addition to Dread. Emmy are robots that have gone rogue. They're invincible and will kill you on the spot if they catch up to you. While you can melee counter them, the timing is random and very hard to pull off, so just don't let them catch you to begin with. They have a bubble around them where they detect movement and head to your last location if the radar is pinged.
Emmy would like to know your location.
This is where the Phantom Cloak comes into play, since it cloaks your movements and the health drain isn't a big deal since it's instant death if they touch you anyway. They'll still head to your last location and can bump into you lethally though, so watch out. As if that wasn't good enough, later Emmy have extra abilities like Speed Boost and the nasty of them actually freezing you with its scanner. Each Emmy is completely invincible but confined to a certain area. The objective is just to get out of their zones alive until you can reach the central unit of each area. Once you do, you then fight an organic computer brain very reminiscent of Mother Brain with its means of defense, and then absorb it and make Samus's cannon turn red, the Omega Cannon. Not to be confused with the Omega Cannon from Metroid Prime Hunters. This is the only way to defeat the Emmy. A charged shot from it is enough to completely destroy an Emmy for good. However, it's not quite so simple, because later on they gain faceplates so you have to melt off with sustained fire before going for that charge shot. I died many times to these sequences, but thankfully the game has some very generous checkpoints. If you die to an Emmy while stealthing around, you appear outside of the last entrance you used to get into its zone. Die during the Omega Cannon segments and it takes you to right after getting said Omega Cannon so you can try again. I'm grateful the game does this because it really cuts down on what would otherwise be a lot of repetitive trekking to get back to the same location. Overall, I'd say the Emmy accomplished what they needed to and actually feel like what the SAX could have been if the GBA wasn't so limited. SAX becomes far less scary when you realize it's all scripted encounters and all but one are just waiting for it to leave. With the Emmy, they will actively pursue you, at least in their zone, so it feels a lot more dynamic. You dread going into those areas if you'll pardon the pun. Speaking of X, the X-Parasites do actually end up showing up later in the game. This isn't really much of a spoiler since Samus is initially drawn to the planet because of footage with them in it. Thankfully, her Metroid genetics means they'll be absorbed the second they try to enter her, so there won't be any more SAX situations. Fighting a Core X with 3D models was a pretty interesting spectacle though. And speaking of references to other Metroid games, one thing I actually found kind of amusing is the spin boost, which allows you to double jump. While it obviously becomes obsolete the second you gain the space jump, I kind of have to wonder if Mercury Steam didn't add it as an homage to Metroid Prime. Its space jump was always a double jump, since I guess infinite jumps would lead to problems in a fully 3D game. The Storm Missile was no doubt inspired by the homing missile from Metroid Prime 2, but with a twist. Each target gets 3 missiles rather than 1, and you can stack them to the same target just like with that homing missile. This becomes very handy with more durable enemies, especially bosses, since you can barrage them very quickly and build up targets while you're evading their attacks. It's pretty slick dodging an attack while simultaneously releasing a flurry of missiles into their face. One neat addition is a cross bomb that's basically a charged morph ball bomb, not to be confused with power bombs, and fires in a T-shape. It can propel you across collapsible tiles, of course, in addition to making Samus look like Bomberman. A couple of items also got changed. The Spider Ball is now the Spider Magnet that allows you to climb surfaces separately from Morph Ball, handy if you still need to shoot things. It also takes from the Prime version, so magnetic surfaces only. It also has moving platform variants that kinda reminds me of the lifts from Other M. Another cool thing is that once you get the grapple beam, you can shoot yourself over to them like you're Spider-Man. You know, in addition to swinging from points, also like Spider-Man. Probably the most interesting change from a plot perspective is that the Various suit no longer protects from the cold. I can only assume this has to do with Samus's Metroid genetics, although Fusion's Various suit did protect from the cold. Don't worry though, the Gravity suit provides full immunity in addition to its usual lava protecting properties. I guess they just wanted to put more emphasis on Samus's cold weakness, and there is a plot point that actually makes sense, but more on that later. Missiles operate like they did in Fusion, with super missiles providing extra power over the normal missiles and ice missiles providing a freezing effect. One cool thing, however, is that you gain the ability to make your beam weapon explode. What I mean is the diffusion beam explodes on a charge shot. It seems like another thing somewhat inspired by Other M, thus proving Other M still had good ideas. It's like a precursor to the wave beam where you can still damage things just behind a surface. Perhaps the one thing I have a minor gripe for with items is the speed boost. Basically, you have to click the left analog stick while running to charge it up. It's obviously not a deal breaker by any means, but you move with the left analog stick, so it's not the most natural solution in the world. I guess it's so that you don't go into it while running accidentally, but I kind of wish something else was done for that. Again, it's pretty minor, it didn't really impact my enjoyment of the game at all, just something to keep in mind. At least you can melee counter in the air to get out of spin jumps, so you can more easily shine spark in the air, very handy. One thing to note then is that the game can get very challenging at times, especially if you're going for certain upgrades. They're certainly not afraid to require some shine sparking skills this time around. I hope you practiced getting that secret message in Fusion, at least if you want some of those Missile Plus tanks. They do give you a whopping 10 missiles for your troubles, however, compared to the normal that now only provide 2. Energy parts have also returned from Other M, providing basically Zelda pieces of heart to hopefully gain a whole one with 4. 2 bosses, though, were particularly nasty. The final boss especially, I almost wasn't going to beat it, but I decided to give it one last go, and I somehow managed to win. It never truly felt unfair, mind you. You can eventually learn their patterns, but be prepared to sweat a little. Certain people who review games have voiced their displeasure in this kind of difficulty, but I overcame it and it feels sweet when you do. Basically expect to have to get good at this one. Or you could just always bloat yourself on energy tanks and other upgrades to give yourself more of a fighting chance, that works too. Overall, I'd say the gameplay was very well tuned to what you'd expect from a Metroid game. There's plenty of winks and nods to other Metroid games, and it really builds well off of what Samus Returns laid the groundwork towards. Once you find your rhythm, it's very snappy and satisfying when you actually pull things off. That final boss in particular, I was practically singing hymns when I finally overcame all of his crap. Also helps that unacquired upgrades blink for their general area to give you an idea without flat out telling you, and though I got lost a few times, the game really does a good job subtly leading you to where you're supposed to go next. Exploration and backtracking are the bread and butter of Metroid and Metroidvania, and there's plenty of that here. More than a few times, you'll remember a place you couldn't access that you suddenly found the solution for, and the game even lets you freely travel between teleporters once you've unlocked all of them. If you're a fan of Metroid and don't mind having the heat turned up in places, I think there's plenty to love here. Just put on your Various suit and you'll be just fine. Naturally, this game takes place after Metroid Fusion with the supposed destruction of the sinister X-Parasite. At least so Samus thinks, until she's lured to ZDR with footage of the X-Parasite still being alive and well, presumably some of them having made it to that planet beforehand. However, if you think it's just gonna copy the same beats of Fusion, you'd better think again. Upon arriving, a Chozo warrior grabs Samus and proceeds to leave her drained of most of her equipment. If I had a nickel for every time that happened, I'd have 2 nickels since her stuff was also stolen on Prime 2. Not many nickels, but kinda weird that happened twice. In any case, it was a trap, and the entirety of the game is Adam AI trying to get Samus back to her ship in one piece. That's one nice thing about the Adam AI here. He clearly still has the Adam in him because he acts very compassionate in this game. It's not about barking orders like most of Fusion, it's about just getting Samus out of there. You genuinely get the sense that the AI cares about her well-being. With the X-Parasite looming around, a Chozo warrior that straight up owned the more equipped Samus, and several rogue Emmy on the loose, the odds certainly aren't looking too hot for her in her weakened form. That's another way it seems a bit inspired by Fusion, but not in the copy-paste way, the good kind of way. Much like Fusion, it's all about trying to survive it all and building yourself back up, but now it's a member of the race that raised Samus that you're trying to survive, which lends some emotional weight to it. More than just a clone of herself with rolled over eyes at least. Samus Returns already laid the groundwork to the idea that not every Chozo is quite so benevolent, something that sorta makes sense since it would explain their downfall. Having some Chozo that are still alive is a feat in and of itself, really, even if it's an enemy. That's one thing that actually surprised me about the plot now that I'm on the subject. Since, spoilers for an over 18-year-old game, Samus defied the Galactic Federation's order and crashed a ship into SR-388, I figured they'd be cross with her. They must have resolved it at some point, because in what I can describe as the opposite of Other M that didn't even mention the Chozo, the Galactic Federation are in the background this time around. Honestly, I kind of like that, since the Chozo were the ones who raised her and gave her some of their genetics to survive the harshness of their world in the first place. As cool as Adam is, and I'm glad the AI showcases his compassion, Other M having Samus act like Adam was her only father figure really irked me. As if the Chozo didn't even exist or something. I'm gonna do something a little different here and split the plot into a spoiler and non-spoiler section. Not even gonna lie, I lifted that idea straight from Angry Joe. All I'll say is the plot ended up being a very nice web of Samus and aspects of her past. The conflict of the Chozo and the plot twist with Samus's donated genetics really had me hooked. If you don't want to be spoiled, look at the timestamp for presentation and go from there right now. Failure to do so will result in an Emmy speeding towards your location.
I'm coming for you.
Hopefully anyone who didn't want to actually be spoiled is gone, so it's time to get on to the really good stuff. Samus learning that she was turning into a Metroid was pretty freaking awesome. I actually think it justifies the Various suit no longer protecting from the cold, since it demonstrably has an effect on her suit. Having her almost instinctively drain a creature before opting to shoot it and then later draining an Emmy were a great way to lead into the revelation. Apparently the Chozo had a Thoha tribe and a Makan tribe. The former controlled the Metroids while the latter were a warrior tribe. The Chozo warrior named Ravenbeak is the latter and wishes to utilize Samus's Metroid DNA to bring about his idea of universal peace. Honestly, I figured someone would try to use Samus's Metroid DNA to make new Metroids, but I figured it would be remnants of the Space Pirates of the Galactic Federation since they both did it before. Never would have thought a Chozo would be the one behind it all. Samus possesses DNA for both tribes, so while the Metroid DNA didn't activate right away due to the Thoha influence, Ravenbeak's attack was apparently the catalyst. The game even fakes you out by making it seem like the Adam AI is trying to get Samus to obey, making it sound like some directive by the Galactic Federation. Given Fusion, and Other M, I was sort of ready to believe it took that twist. Not that Adam AI would do so willingly, but maybe that a higher-up hacked him or something. Thankfully it was a ploy by Ravenbeak, who even calls Samus his daughter. He meant because his genetics were given to her, but between the menacing combat prowess and the metal armor,
You can't tell me that wasn't a deliberate Darth Vader moment.
Samus's Metroid DNA reaching its peak and going green suit was just amazing, as was the moment prior where she appears to be down and then suddenly grabs and drains Ravenbeak. Escaping with a hyper beam with Super Metroid goodness on steroids, and having an X-Parasite even seemed to help her by nullifying her Metroid form so she can pilot her ship without draining it was an interesting twist. Perhaps not so far out of left field if you interpret it as just opposing its mortal enemy by trying to nullify her Metroid DNA, but it's interesting that its Chozo form was bowing respectively to her beforehand. Maybe for the first time an X-Parasite actually gained compassion, or maybe I'm reading way too much into this. So yeah, as I said before, I thought the plot was really well done. The conflict between her and a warrior faction of the Chozo was handled beautifully, and the struggle for survival was constant. This proves that anyone who dismisses the game's value because it's 2.5D is a fool, because it not only has compelling gameplay, it also has a very satisfying plot to boot. Supposedly Mercury Steam is hoping to make a sequel to this, and if this is any indication, I can't wait to see what they have in store next. Plot has earned my approval. This lad here definitely has no objections. If I had to guess, the game utilizes the Samus Returns engine but spruced up. I am in no way saying this is bad, however. Unlike Game Freak, Mercury Steam isn't just upscaling 3DS assets and calling it a day. The game really does utilize the power of the Nintendo Switch with fairly detailed environments and creatures to match. The cutscenes especially do a great job highlighting the amount of fidelity captured in every 3D model, from Samus herself to major enemies like the Chozo Warrior and the X-Parasites. If I may take just 1 minute to geek out here, they actually included Kraid in on the action. I've been remorsing the fact that Ridley seems to get shoved everywhere, including Samus Returns, while Kraid appearing in 2 games, 3 if you count a remake of one of the first 2. You can imagine my surprise then when I saw him in the trailer. They really do a good job making him look and sound intimidating, and it's sort of telling that he has to be restrained, since you can imagine how destructive he'd be if he was set free. Not gonna spoil anything, but his model is also put to great use later on in the game. Emmy, the game's flagship edition, are likewise fittingly intimidating looking. They come across like Xenomorphs meets the robotic technology of Aperture Science, and I think it works out fairly well. The way they crawl around and even stab at you from their eye definitely make me think of Alien, which is fitting given Metroid was inspired by the movie. They also come in different colors, effectively showing which ones have what abilities. For example, the yellow one, which I've dubbed Lemon, moves at high speed, so it's especially important you don't let it detect you, since outrunning it is going to be hard. Each environment is also nicely varied and full of life. Areas with water are especially impressive, with bubbles, a light amount of refraction, and the surfaces reacting to things like Samus impacting with them. A really nice video by Loogie Bros, which I placed in the description below, showcases some really impressive little details, such as heated or iced areas bleeding through the doors as a warning, and Samus's legs conforming to things like ramps. These are all things Mercury Steam really didn't have to do, and yet they took the time to do it. Metroid has always been about building its atmosphere through little touches, especially the Prime games, so seeing things like that is just awesome. The music is likewise a treat to listen to, with both some tracks returning like the fanfare in Super Metroid's theme, but with plenty of new ones to listen to too. Some, like the network station, sound more reminiscent of Fusion, while others sound like they fit in well with Prime. Emmy actually have 3 different tracks to let you know if they're idly patrolling, actively searching for you, or are actively on the hunt. The final boss music especially has a pretty epic feeling to it, showcasing that it really is the do-or-die moment of the game. Notably, the game also has voice acting, including for Samus Aran. Granted, she only speaks in one scene of the game, and it's in the Chozo language, which is actually appropriate. Really, that composes most of the voice lines between her and a couple of Chozos, it being in that language. Of course, the one other voice who speaks extensively in English is Adam AI. Rather than attempting to possibly make him sound similar to other M's Adam, since Fusion's AI obviously lacks a voice, it goes for a very deep-pitched artificial voice. While it's very artificial and filtered, it's interestingly contrasted with the AI's concern for Samus throughout the game. Sound effects are fine too, nothing to say about them as always. Presentation-wise, Metroid Dread is quite good. You can tell Mercury Steam really went out of their way to fill the game with the kind of love and attention the franchise really deserves, and they've proven themselves worthy of the atmosphere and tone. The isolated moments feel appropriately oppressive, and the story beats have the right tone to them too. I was never against the idea of Samus talking, just other M ridiculously overdoing it. Giving her one line of assurance that she'll put an end to this, and in her caretaker's native language no less, is a great place to put her spoken dialogue in. Both visually and audibly, presentation has my wholehearted approval. They really take full advantage of the Switch's power quite beautifully if you ask me. Metroid Samus Returns benefited from a bit of a slump in Metroid. It was over a decade since Metroid Prime 3, with Other M being mixed at best and Federation Force just being laughable if you're looking for a Metroid game. Thankfully, it wasn't just a fluke, because Mercury Steam more than proved themselves worthy of the Metroid franchise with this one. While I'll probably always prefer the Prime games overall, I can definitely say Dread delivers on all fronts and is not only a spectacular Metroid game, but is a pretty spectacular game overall. It plays very well, has a rich story that still manages to bring on the isolated Metroid charm, and is gorgeous on the eyes and ears. You're doing yourself a massive disservice if you dismiss this game just because it's a side-scroller. I'd even personally place it above Bloodstained Ritual of the Night in that category, although given my username used to be Metroid Junkie, I must confess to being a tad biased. Even so, I highly recommend it if you're a fan of Metroid or even Metroidvania games. There's a lot to love here with plenty of new and old to leave you satisfied. And this has been my review of Metroid Dread for the Nintendo Switch. I've got a live stream of Fallout 4 Friday at 4:30 p.m., news video next Thursday at 6 p.m., and Let's Plays at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. daily. If you like Metroid, I'm also doing Other M Maximum Edition Monday at 4:30 p.m. This is all Eastern Standard Time, but feel free to subscribe and attack that bell icon if you want to keep notified. A like is always appreciated, but I just hope you genuinely enjoyed it, and that is it for now. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. This week's epic freebie until next Thursday is the 2-4, their Godfall Challenger Edition and Prison Architect. Two games that probably couldn't be more different if they tried. Capitalize on life, peace out, have a good one, and I'll see you next mission.